Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 2 on Modern Genocide in Latin America. We're taking our next big picture look at the global history of genocide in a regional or continental sense, starting at the turn of the 16th century leading all the way up to today. Key cases include the early 16th century Taino people in the Caribbean, the mid-19th century Pampas, the late 19th century Cuban War of Independence, Cold War era Argentina and Guatemala, and the Amazon today. Let's start with reading 1, which is a 16th century primary source by the famous Spanish friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who of course didn't have the term genocide at his disposal, but that was essentially what he was talking about. In fact, Raphael Lemkin acknowledged Las Casas as an important predecessor in the genealogy or intellectual history of genocide. Reading 1 is his famous first and second-hand account of Spanish colonization. This primary source is an example of what Holocaust studies calls bearing witness, where memory is conjured essentially in order to address another, to impress a listener, to appeal to a community. In this case, Las Casas was appealing directly to King Charles V of Spain for a more humane treatment of the Indians. As with Lemkin, Las Casas wrote to inform, but also to persuade. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, and sometimes the raw facts and analytical nuance gets lost in the appeal for attention. It's said that pictures supposedly tell 1,000 words. This engraving was published in the original edition of Las Casas's brief account. I'm really interested in discussing the rhetorical functions of atrocity art, and how can we effectively use such images in the classroom? Should we even? Anyways, as we analyze the context behind reading 1, the extent to which Las Casas himself was implicated in the very system that he critiqued. He came to the Americas as a conquistador, but reformed into a widely revered missionary. His biography represents a paradox at the heart of the Spanish colonial project. On the one hand, he and other advocates managed to convince the crown that indigenous peoples were rational human beings who should be quote-unquote saved, or really converted and assimilated, but at the very least not marked as wild beasts who could be exterminated with impunity. In this sense, Las Casas was against genocide. That's why Lemkin liked him so much. On the other hand, colonial authorities on the ground were enormously invested in the continued exploitation of indigenous slave labor, which in effect led to mass death. Likewise, Las Casas implored missionaries to respect indigenous rights only to the extent that it was a tactic in ultimately assimilating and erasing differences. So this may be a blunt way of putting it, but I wonder if Las Casas was against what we call, if not favored, what some might call ethnocide. If Las Casas represents the softer, gentler notion of ethnocide, then Columbus represents the more extreme sense of genocide as mass murder. Recommended reading number 7 this week is an encyclopedic entry on the Taino people who first encountered Columbus. On the island of Hispaniola alone, there were as many as 8 million Taino in 1492. Half a century later, only 2,000 survived. Of course, this is an imprecise approximation. We'll never know the exact numbers, but the outcome was clear. There were, of course, multiple causes of this and all took their toll. But was this a genocide? Like I said last week, this is the wrong question to ask. Clearly, it's part of a general history of genocide in the modern world. For what it's worth, Lemkin clearly thought so. I, for one, am very comfortable in calling it a genocide. The Taino were nearly driven extinct, but against all odds, they have survived and resisted destruction like so many other indigenous peoples in the Americas. In any case, these colonial origins had a lasting impact in the historical construction of modern identities in Latin America. Spanish invasion led to a new Eurocentric in-group that established and consolidated hegemonic power over colonized out-groups, primarily in terms of indigenous peoples, and in many places, black slaves. The population economy of Latin America was thus predicated upon a rigid and hierarchical dichotomy. You may recall this slide from week 3 of Underpinnings. The point here is that colonialism produced a hegemonic social structure predicated upon an us versus them dichotomization, an important risk factor for genocide. Here's another slide from Underpinnings, where we discussed how the dichotomization function enables both moderate and extreme forms of othering. In other words, there are both softer and harder versions of dehumanization. The difference between them tracks with the aforementioned difference between Las Casas and Columbus. I don't want to get lost in that analogy. The more general point here is that the Spanish, and Europeans more generally, imported logics of racism that continue to structure Latin American society, as indigenous peoples and blacks were, and often still are, objects of dehumanization. This racist legacy of European colonialism was reproduced post-colonial movement towards Latin American independence in the early 19th century. Many of these new states were dominated by a class of los criollos, or those of Spanish descent, i.e. white people. They were atop of what was essentially a neo-feudal economy of staple agriculture based on servile labor. The region was underdeveloped, according to its peripheral status in the world economy. And this raises another important risk factor for genocide. More on that in a second. Anyways, reading 2 this week provides some theoretical context for this general point, which also helps contextualize Latin American history in relation to the related variants of settler colonialism that we saw last week in North America. Some parts of Latin America, especially the Southern Cone, developed classical settler colonial countries based on white immigration and the logic of elimination. This was especially the case in Argentina, for example. Here you see a picture of Juan Manuel de Rosas, who was a wealthy Criollo who basically established a dictatorship in Buenos Aires around the same time of Andrew Jackson's first term as president of the U.S. The parallels don't end there, as de Rosas led the so-called Desert Campaign against the indigenous peoples of southern Pampas and northern Patagonia. This episode is only briefly mentioned in Reading 3, which instead focuses upon the so-called conquest of the desert in the 1870s into the 80s. And we can talk more about how, given the temporal disconnect between this image and our assigned readings. Basically, it's the same place and same actors, separated only by a few decades. In any case, the settler colonial form exemplified by Argentina was more of an exceptional case. In other parts of the continent, where indigenous populations were much larger, such as Mexico, new national identities were built around the mestizo, or the notion that Spanish and indigenous elements mixed into one new identity. This didn't include those of African descent, mind you, and even in this model, the normative position of European descent was clearly dominant over the quote-unquote backwards or primitive subject position of Los Indios was the term used by the Spanish colonizers to identify the subordinate position in the social construction of the mestizo, although Los Indios was generally abandoned as a term after independence, when it was replaced by the Spanish word for a poor, rural tenant farmer, el campesino. This shift from Los Indios to el campesino is part of the integrative revolution that we'll talk about next week. And none of this made genocide inevitable, but this macro-level structural perspective is necessary to see the historical production of risk factors that continue to exist. So as we trace the shifting forms of modern genocide in Latin America, let's turn to the Cuban War of Independence in the late 19th century. Reading 4 revisits the origins of the concentration camp, particularly in relation to this particular historical figure associated with the policy of reconcentrado, which was designed to separate insurgents from civilians by forcibly relocating the latter while waging a scorched earth campaign against the former. It's important to understand how this counterinsurgency strategy came together in a broader context, considering these other cases of colonial warfare at the same time. For example, we'll come back to the case of the Herero in week 8. Anyways, Reading 4 goes on to trace this strategy and other colonial conflicts later on in the 20th century. We're not necessarily interested in the details of these other cases. Rather, the big point here is that when the Nazis opened their first camp in Dachau in 1933, they were tapping into an already existent technology of sovereign power. Similarly, when we consider the internment camps in Western China that are being used right now against the Uyghurs, which we'll discuss in week 7, it's important to understand this broader genealogy or intellectual history of the camp. We've come across all this before. Here's a slide from week 6 of Underpinnings, when we read Giorgio Agamben's critical analysis of the concentration camp as an instrument of sovereign power in the production of bare life. This is for those of you who are perhaps more theoretically inclined, but the general point here is to understand the genealogy of the camp as a modern legal artifact. But let's get back on track. In order to make the 3 general cycles of political violence in post-independence Latin American history. First was the hegemonic violence of the traditional order, where the dominant Creole class represented a continuity of colonial hierarchies. State formation was stabilized under this oligarchic order that used violence to perpetuate the exclusion of the masses from the political sphere. For example, this is where the Cuban War of Independence fits in. Second, the middle half of the 20th century was marked by the rise of mass politics and the advent of nationalist populist regimes. It was in this context that the ideological framing of the Cold War produced a zero-sum competition over state power. Finally, we are currently in a new period of violence in post-authoritarian Latin America, where violence increasingly appears as an option for a multitude of actors in pursuit of all kinds of goals. For example, we could look at the current Mexican drug war in this context, but I'll come back to this later with the contemporary Amazon. Yet, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's pause for a moment and look at the shift between these first two periods, as the social divisions inherited from colonial hierarchies were produced and mutated post-independence. During this first period, the basic social division was between the masses and the traditional order. But once the so-called masses began contesting political power, the ideological terms of the social divide were recast, as political opponents of modern nationalist regimes were turned into subversive criminals to be rooted out and destroyed. This is a key premise of Reading 5, the author of which, Daniel Feierstein, fits into this body of theory from Week 3 of Underpinnings, when we discussed the social imaginary of genocide in terms of a collective, psychopathological strategic logic. That's a mouthful, but I often refer to this idea as the perpetrator-victim paradox. Feierstein lays out this argument in a recent book, which contributes to the historiography on genocide as social engineering. Here are relevant slides from Week 6 of Underpinnings to provide some historiographical background. In particular, this latter one, as Daniel Feierstein's theory of reorganizing genocide fits into this metaphor of genocide as a form of human gardening. The general point here is the dual use of genocide to both destroy political opposition and to restructure society, as the threat of destruction was used to establish new models of identity. This is where we pick up with Reading 5, to establish new models of identity. This is where we pick up with Reading 5, as the author introduces the so-called internal political enemy as a new socially constructed identity. This argument fits into the theory that the genos, or the targeted group, is not so objectively real as it is subjectively imagined by the perpetrators. In this form of genocide, the target for destruction is directed inward at an already established society within the nation-state. Accordingly, the genos of reorganizing genocides are typically identified as subversive criminals who are quote-unquote infecting society. Now, this theoretical background isn't in Reading 5, but it is helpful to understand his argument. Indeed, in genocide and political violence in Cold War-era Latin America, as the extreme paranoia facilitated the aforementioned construction of the subversive as a target for destruction. This process of identity construction was a product of a transnational diffusion of perpetrator knowledge, in which the American military and intelligence complex played a key role in maintaining right-wing regimes by providing military training and political cover for waging low-intensity counterinsurgency warfare. The case of Argentina is especially pertinent, not least because of its contemporary ramifications, but also because it taps into an important side theme of resilience. Here you see pictures of the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who for decades met every week in this public square in Buenos Aires, demanding answers for the 30,000 plus people who were quote-unquote disappeared during the so-called Dirty War of the 1970s. In any case, let's hone in on Feierstein's argument in Reading 5, where, starting on page 500, he makes a step-by-step case for reinterpreting the legal meaning of political groups in relation to his theory of reorganizing genocide. This argument also pertains to Reading 6, which brings up the case of Guatemala. Here we open with the 2013 conviction of Guatemalan General Rios Montt. This was the first time ever that a former head of state was found guilty of genocide in a national court. Now, Reading 6 highlights the specifically gendered dimensions to this case, even noting that the judge in the 2013 case stipulated that a separate apology should be delivered to female survivors. More specifically, the authors focus on the limit of violence within the current legal domain. On page 277 of Reading 6, they set up an important contrast between the Spanish language concepts resarcimiento, which is roughly translated as economic compensation, and reparación integral, or holistic reparations. Of course, there are limits to reparations for genocide. How can one repair the irreparable? But the push for reparación integral has been translated into the everyday work of repair, enabling the female survivors of genocide to articulate their losses and harm suffered, not just during the genocide, but even now, as they continue to express their indignation against the climate of impunity generated by the Guatemalan state. Crucially, this everyday work of repair is producing an emerging sense of protagonism, as a community of female survivors has come together for mutual support and collective renewal. This brings to mind a recent Guatemalan feature film about the aftermath of genocide. I'll share a trailer on Moodle, but you can find the full-length film on Shudder, which is a streaming service specializing in horror films. Mind you, this is different from the American horror film The Curse of La Llorona, which came out around the same time. Although this is an emerging interest I have in the hauntology of genocide, The reason I bring it up here is to highlight the analytical essay assignment. Again, I talk about all of this in the syllabus, and you see the main requirements here. Basically, by the end of next week, you need to submit a paragraph that identifies a particular piece of literature, film, or art that deals with a specific case of genocide. This film is an example of what I have in mind. Now, I really need to wrap up, but before I do, let me share this slide under construction. As I continue to develop this course into the future, the Amazon is an important contemporary context that needs to be further highlighted. Due to time limitations, I'm just going to have to skip over it for now. With that said, I'm done. Here are the next steps. Apart from our weekly discussion forum, you not only have the aforementioned paragraph for the analytical essay, but another paragraph for the case study assignment. The purpose of both of these assignments due next week is to simply check and see due at the end of the semester. More on that later. For now, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.